We'd better start. Welcome to the Chairman's Seminar Series. Today we have Ian Morrow, who will present the EU's Cap and Trade Program. I'm Feridun Faizalahi of the Economic Studies section. Let me introduce Ian. He's on loan from the UK government under a program agreed by our governor and the Prime Minister Tony Blair. They wanted California and UK as leaders in their regions to cooperate more on the question of how to tackle the global warming issues. Ian is here to start that off. I think we've started it. Because he has spent the last 3 years working in London on the EU's Cap and Trade Program, something that we're looking at here in California. He's going to talk about the EU's experience on cap and trade, what worked, what didn't, that is the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have a couple of hours here, and so I hope we can have a real solid discussion. It looks like this topic is quite popular. I don't know if it's the topic or his accent that you're here for. Please do ask questions. This presentation is being webcast, so if you're listening on the web, there is an email on the on a monitor that you can just send questions to. So I won't take too much time. And here's Ian.
Great, am I on? Good. Okay, well thank you very much, Feridun, and thank you everyone for coming. And thank you also to the ARB for giving me the opportunity to be here. When we were setting this assignment up, a lot of people at home said, 6 months in California, tough assignment. So, yeah, it's great. They didn't know about the smoke and the 108 degrees, but they thought it was good. Anyway, crack on. As Feridun said, I'm here to talk about Europe's experience with Cap and Trade Program for greenhouse gas emissions. I'm, as Feridun said, on loan from the UK government, from the Industry Department to ARB until September. And one thing I'd like to say before I start is that you might be wondering who I'm speaking for here. Am I speaking for ARB? Am I speaking for the UK government? This is all going to be a personal view. So please don't attribute anything I say here to either ARB or UK, just to avoid any confusion. Keep lawyers happy, so on. So what are we going to cover? 3 things. How Europe got to the decision to have a cap and trade program, how it set it up, how the pilot went, how the current program is going, and where the EU might go in the future. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the international dimension later on in the talk. Planning to talk for about 30-35 minutes with a pause halfway through for any clarifying questions, and then big questions at the end. I'd also like to say what this talk won't cover. And what it won't cover is questions about the science of climate change, because as your governor said, that's over. And it won't cover questions about the level of the cap, what the appropriate goals are for California, the EU, or whatever. This talk is very much about one policy tool among many for achieving those goals. It's not about whether those are the right goals. We could spend a long time debating those, but if you want to talk about AB 32, that's your man. This is something that seems to be reasonably well known, but I think it's worth stating again. Cap and trade is a US idea. It's not a European idea. This was designed, tested, and proven by the US EPA as part of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And Europe, despite being skeptical initially about it, copied many of the elements of that program for its own program. Talk a little bit about the interplay between EU and US views on cap and trade later. So, a bit of prehistory. Why did Europe decide it wanted to put a price on carbon? In 1997, well, think back 11 years, Europe signed up for targets under the Kyoto Protocol. And then it decided it needed to have a think about how it would achieve those targets. And one of the policies it wanted to put in place was to put a price on emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. It wanted the polluter to pay for producing them. Now, the reason it wanted to use that as a policy tool is it gives an incentive to reduce emissions cost effectively, which is code for cheaply. Europe had agreed the goals, and then it wanted to achieve those goals as cheaply as possible and at minimum cost to the European economy. It also gives a financial incentive for new technologies that hadn't been thought of. It was recognized this was a big problem and that for long-term emission reductions, there needed to be new technologies developed. Another aim of this program, and we'll come to why this is a sticking point in a minute, is that they wanted to have the same price Europe-wide. Businesses in Europe wanted to have the same cost of emissions, whichever European country they were in. They wanted to have a level playing field, unlike national taxes. So the choice Europe faced was to have either a cap-and-trade program or a tax. Europe initially thought that cap-and-trade was some kind of wacky US idea, and so they thought that they would do a tax. They tried to agree a tax between the 15 countries of Europe at the time, and they failed. And the reason they failed is that countries guard their tax-raising powers very carefully. They guard the right to put taxes on, to choose what their own level of tax is very carefully. And so surrendering those powers to a supranational body like the EU was a step too far. Europe does have carbon taxes on things like transport, but they are country-specific. Second reason was that Europe was already facing a hard cap as a result of the Kyoto Protocol. They had to reduce emissions by 8% from 1990 levels. And so European governments, who, as part of the Kyoto Protocol, are participants in their own cap-and-trade scheme, said, we have this hard target. Let's reduce the risk that we won't meet it by giving industry and the electricity sector a hard target too. Then we know that that part of the economy is going to achieve the reductions we need. And I think the guarantee of achieving those targets was a real selling point. I think it's also worth saying, before we get into the details of the EU program, that actually there's a lot of misconceptions about cap-and-trade, and there's a kind of obsession with markets that obscures what the program is all about. And I'd argue that it's not that different to direct regulation. What you have is that anybody emitting carbon dioxide needs to have a license to do so. And for each ton they emit, they need to have a permit. Those permits can be, the emitters can trade those permits between each other, and that's it. So, because you only issue a limited number of permits every year, the total is fixed. And so you achieve your environmental target. The trading element, which I think is the more controversial one, allows business to have flexibility to take account of unexpected events, of local circumstances, differences between European countries, differences in levels of economic development, and so on. Low hydro years, for example, in the power sector. It also has the benefit of having penalties and incentives for emissions built in. Two main groups of stakeholders in Europe who have commented on cap-and-trade, and I think it's worth comparing the two because they're often at odds. It's worth saying before we go into this that, as I said, I'm from the industry department, so my natural sympathies probably don't lie with the lower group. Anyway, once business has, once the need for action on climate change is accepted, once you have decided what the goal is, then of the ways that that goal can be achieved, European business prefers cap-and-trade to a tax or to direct regulation. And the reason for that is that it's cheaper, there's an incentive for overperformance, and it's more flexible and less prescriptive. Environmental groups like the certainty of the hard target They like the certainty the environmental goal is going to be achieved. If you like, environmental groups like the CAP and business likes the trade. A few facts and figures. Just use the mouse pointer here. This slice on the top right is the proportion of European greenhouse gas emissions that the EU emission trading scheme covers. It's about 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions and about half of total carbon dioxide. What's in other CO2? You've got transport, road transport. We'll talk about that more in a minute. You have heating for households and buildings, and anything outside the electricity and industry sectors. You also have, until recently, aviation. Non-CO2 emissions, high global warming potential greenhouse gases like methane, HFCs, SO6, and so on. Quick comparison here of California and Europe in terms of where the emissions come from by sector. I've grouped the emissions into 4 categories: electricity, energy and industry on the left, then transport, agriculture and forestry, and other. The message, the obvious message from this slide, is that per capita emissions are fairly comparable for most sectors, with the exception of transport, where they're 3 times higher per capita in California than the EU. And this is probably one explanation why Europe has been much slower to talk about including transport emissions in any cap and trade program than people here in California. So you might ask, well, that's 40% of Europe's emissions. What about the other 60%? Europe actually put forward its version of the scoping plan in January this year. And that was a suite of 4 measures. Renewable energy, so a renewable portfolio standard, if you like, energy efficiency measures, carbon capture and storage, and cap and trade. So the point here is that it's often presented as a choice between cap and trade or other measures. In fact, it's not. Cap and trade is one of the measures that Europe is looking at. And in fact, if you compare the measures that Europe is doing to the measures in the scoping plan, over 90% of the measures in the scoping plan have an analog in Europe. Energy efficiency standards, check. Vehicle efficiency standards, check. Renewable portfolio standard, high global warming potential gases, and so on and so on. This is not the only measure. There's also a recognition that there's a role for government in supporting R&D, in driving energy efficiency in sectors where, either because people aren't aware of the opportunities or because they don't have the capital, there are barriers to taking up those available energy efficiency measures. These are the industrial and electricity sectors that are covered. Now, they see this rather a long list. Anything that generates more than 20 megawatts, anything where a typical company generates more than 20 megawatts is the criteria for this. The takeaway message here is that the majority is electricity generation, nearly 3/4 in the UK. Whether that's something about us being a service economy, I don't know. Before I will get on to the details of the program eventually. Also worth talking about the scale of the task that Europe faced when it was setting up its program. Europe is a collection of countries. It's not a collection of states. And it's a collection of 27 very different countries with 20 official languages, 3 different alphabets, 12,000 emitters, 427 million people, which is, I think, like 12, 13 times the population of California. And the cap and trade program now includes about 2 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year, out of a European total of about 5 billion, which is more or less 10 times California's emissions. So it's a big program. Those countries are also very different. Just one measure here, which is GDP per head. You'll see there are countries, ignore Luxembourg. You'll see that the countries on the left-hand side whose GDP is comparable to the United States. Countries in blue are European, countries in black hatch are non-European. So in second left, you've got the US, And then you've got Ireland, UK, Germany, France. Same sort of level. You then go into the next group of countries, Czech Republic, Poland, former Soviet bloc countries, GDP more or less that of South Korea. And then you go to Russia, Chile, Mexico. And you've got a couple of European countries whose GDP per head is below that of Chile and Mexico. So a very diverse group of countries. Because it's such a diverse group and because it's such a big project, Europe did a pilot. And what that pilot did, that pilot lasted 3 years, 2005 to 7, is it put in place the systems, the monitoring system protocols, the data systems, allowed Europe to get practical experience before 2008. And the reason 2008 is such an important date is that's when Europe's Kyoto targets kick in. That's 2008 to 12 is when Europe has to achieve the reductions. So for 2005 to 7, they decided to do a soft start. That pilot has come in for a lot of criticism, and of the criticism, I think there's 3 key issues where the criticism was particularly valid. I'll talk about those on the next slide and what Europe is doing to resolve them. Windfall profits. Why did the power companies make all that money from the ETS? I can talk about the mechanism of windfall profits and why it occurred in the UK and what the lessons are for California, but that's not in the main body of the talk. I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A if there's interest. Just for the moment, I think the important thing to say is that those allowances, those permits to emit are valuable. Because you can sell them to someone, they have a value, and that value is quite large. 2 billion tons of emissions in Europe. They're worth nearly $40 each, so that's $78, $80 billion a year. And in the pilot phase, most of those were given to companies for free. Now, you don't have to do it that way. Essentially, what you have to do is you have to decide who you're going to give the value of those allowances to. And you can give it to any or all of the following. You can give it to the electricity companies, as we did in Europe. You can give it back to communities and consumers. You can give it to particular industries who face a lot of competition from countries that don't have price and emissions. You can fund renewable energy. You can use it to reduce corporation taxes. You can use personal taxes. Any combination of the above. That decision is a political one, and it's a subject of a lot of debate in Europe at the moment. Crucially, though, the effectiveness of the program doesn't depend on how that problem is resolved. The effectiveness of the program depends on the cap, the number of permits, allowances that you give out. It doesn't depend on how you distribute them. So you can separate discussions about what the program is going to achieve from who pays for it. The issues and solutions for phase 1. First issue is that it turns out that when we actually monitored closely and checked the emissions from each power plant and industrial site in Europe, we found out that our emissions data was wrong. We found out that we were overestimating how much emissions would grow. The solution to that is that now we have good data for 2005 to 7. We use that as a basis for the future. We ensure that in the future, the number of allowances that we give out is lower than what emissions were in 2005 to 7, meaning there will have to be real reductions. Second problem, windfall profits, because the allowances were given for free. Solution, don't give them for free. Thirdly, industry treated differently in neighboring countries. Because of the various political compromises that were necessary to get the program up and running, countries retained a lot of flexibility in how they could treat industry in their own, how each country could treat its own industry. That led to some distortions, complaints from industry that a steel plant in one country was being treated differently to a steel plant over the border. And so the solution to that is to have a much more harmonized approach. Have an EU-wide single standard for, say, steel plants. What did stakeholders think after the pilot? They thought it was too complicated. Most of the complication is in the allocation, which is what stakeholders fought over. But in the end, there's a realization that it needs to be simple. They'd like the targets, the goals, to be set further ahead. So they'd like them to be set in line with investment cycles, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, rather than the 5 years that Europe set targets ahead. 5 years is not long enough, they said, to plan. And they'd like more of a level playing field across Europe. There's a lot of trade between European countries because it's a free trade area, and there were quite significant distortions. So, the reality. This is where it actually makes a difference. After the pilot, each country then proposed what its own target should be for 2008 to 12, and those were supposed to add up to a European total. What happened was that the European Commission, which is a sort of super European regulator, told those countries that they could not have the sometimes very generous targets they'd given themselves, but they had set targets in line with what they'd agreed under Kyoto. So the message here is, once they'd agreed an overall economy-wide goal, it was much easier to decide what the cap was. It was also much easier to challenge very generous projections of what emissions would have been anyway, because you had the 2005 to 7 data. You could say that emissions doubling in the next few years, which some European countries claimed was unrealistic. A lot of things were rushed in the first phase. Yeah. Do you mind if I take this question at the end? Yeah. I will come back to it, so do remind me. Okay. So, as I was saying, the net result is that targets were revised down by nearly 7%. It did make a difference. It made a difference to the price, which is what the real sign of success would be. You see there's two lines in this graph, the blue line and the pinkish purple line. Blue line is the price for the pilot phase, how much companies had to pay in 2005 to 7 to emit a ton of carbon dioxide. That crashes to zero. That's because there were more permits issued than companies needed, no shortage, price goes to zero. Not a problem with the market working perfectly, supply greater than demand, price zero. A problem with the number of permits. Second line is what companies are now paying, and right up to the end of May and June. You'll see that line is actually positive the whole way through, and there's a gentle trend up. What that reflects is that companies and the market thinks that there's going to have to be real reductions in Europe this year. They think that they think it's worth paying $40 to be able to emit per metric ton of CO2 to be able to emit carbon dioxide. Made a difference to the volatility. Now, this is probably for the market techies among you. Essentially, it made a difference to how variable the price is. What this graph is showing is evidence against the myth that the carbon price the emissions price is all too volatile and it's impossible to plan based on it. What you see here with the blue line is how much the ETS price jumps around over time, and the orange line is how much the coal price jumps around, and the muddy green line is how much the natural gas price jumps around. And you'll see that actually the emissions price for a lot of that time is less volatile than existing commodities that companies have no difficulty planning around. And it finally made a difference to the environment. This number is a projection from the WWF, one of the main environmental non-profits. And it's probably a conservative estimate. There's other estimates out there that go up to 300 or 400 million. It really depends on how much you think Europe would have grown in the absence of the program. But the important fact here is that even under this conservative assumption, we think the program will reduce emissions in Europe by 200 million metric tons this year and for each of the next 5 years. For comparison purposes, that's like emptying California's roads, rail, and planes, making all of California's transport sector run on renewable energy. So it's quite a significant start. Sorry, I don't understand the difference.
Well, is it from what it would otherwise have increased, or
Yes. Yes, that's right. It's a reduction of about 70 from what it was. I'll show that in a graph coming up. Okay. Can I ask if there's any clarifying questions? I've covered, I think, quite a lot here, so please do ask. And can I ask clarifying only, please, at this stage? There'll be chance for a longer discussion.
Yeah, that's. I have, as the gentleman to my right can attest, I have 2 different sections on my page. Trying to respect your request. Clarifying question. I just have 2 quick ones. You talked about taxes at the country level, and I think you clearly explained why EU couldn't get together on that. I am curious to know 2 things about taxes. Is there any overarching trend as to which sectors these taxes tend to be applied to? And the second one, is there any overarching trend as to the disposition of the tax proceeds? I can see perhaps a greater trend for the former than the latter, but I'm curious about that.
I'm not aware of any trend. That's true. That's true, but those sectors are things like aluminum. If there are carbon taxes in Europe at the moment, they are probably more on the transport side. In terms of what's done with the money, yeah, you've hit on another hot button for European governments. Yeah, and I think the attitude is quite different. I think the attitude is that if it's tax money, then mostly it goes into the general pot, the general fund. There are some programs out there. UK, for example, had a program called the Climate Change Levy, where you had a tax on companies that are taxed on energy, and but that tax was revenue neutral because your employee contributions, contributions you paid for employee pensions got reduced. But it depends very much on the politics of the government. There's no hard and fast rule, and countries would resent Europe imposing hard and fast rules because it's their money.
Yeah, on the issue of price and volatility, was there any intervention during this period of time to stabilize the price? Any tools that they used?
No.
Of the greater than 200 million metric tons of CO2 that was reduced, do you have a sense of what the, where those reductions came from? If there were any kind of, large splits in terms of...
Difficult to tell because it's only 6 months into the first year. One of the suggestions is that it's German companies power companies switching from coal to natural gas. But it's only 6 months in, so that would just be speculative at the moment.
Could you tell me what the time frame is on a permit to emit? Does it have a definite expiration date, or is it 1 year intervals?
Sorry, I should have explained that earlier. The permits for the pilot phase expired at the end of the pilot because they were kind of paper money. They weren't. The permits for the current phase never expire. You can keep them forever.
2 quick questions. How did the EU set a 20 megawatt limit to be in the electric sector? And the second question, were renewable energy sources that produce electricity in that cap and trade program?
Well, they're actually revisiting that 20 megawatt threshold. They're actually coming down more to a emissions threshold in the future. I don't know what the process was for the 20 megawatt, I'm afraid, but I can say that for the future, it looks like it's going to be a 10,000 to 25,000 tons of CO2 lower limit. Renewables were not covered by the program, but because the price of electricity in Europe went up as a result of the program, but renewable producers' costs did not go up, they did benefit from it.
before the pilot phase, did Europe have a trading system for criteria pollutants?
No, I don't believe it did.
Okay. My other question, do the countries in the EU have the same fuel price, the same sort of typical price?
No, they don't.
Okay, so was there an issue with the differences in prices of fuel and price levels?
There wasn't. I mean, the countries that, the UK, for example, has a different price. Maybe I can go back to the picture. Okay. So the UK, that little island in the middle left there, has a different price to continental Europe. But actually, it's almost isolated electrically. There's a very small connector between the two. So there wasn't really an issue. European countries have a lot of differences anyway, like different power market structures and so on. No.
Back to my question about consistency in two things. One, in the accreditation process of verifiers, and then two, consistency in the actual verification process.
So your question is, were they consistent?
Right, or were any steps taken to ensure consistency both in the accreditation process and the third-party verification process?
The accreditation is, well, that's all being reconsidered as well. Each European country had to accredit its own verifiers, and that was within, I think, standards set down by the Commission. I'm afraid I'm not an expert in verification or accreditation, so I don't really feel able to answer that. I think my impression is there'll be more steps taken in future to standardize, but these are 27 countries with their own laws. It's difficult. Okay, great. So we've got pretty much to the present day. Talk about the future. One of the problems with the pilot phase is that each country was allowed to set the cap, to its own cap, and then those were added up to give the total. Now, countries were quite generous in setting their own targets because they wanted to shield their industry. We've now reversed that process, and from 2013 onwards, there'll be a European cap, single European cap, which is divided up either between country or by sector. Remember I said that we're going to get more harmonized. So there may not be a target, a cap for Germany or France at all. That cap has now been set so it will reduce by a constant 1.74% of 2010 levels forever. Second change, polluter pays. All electricity generators will have to buy all their permits from 2013 onwards. There'll be none given for free, which will deal with the windfall profits issue. And in fact, the intention is for all of industry to buy all its permits by 2020. So there'll be a glide path away from giving those permits out for free to making industry pay for all of them. Unless there's a risk of this phrase, carbon leakage, which is industry that competes with similar companies in other countries, a lot of international trade, but those countries don't face the same limits on their emissions. The classic example would be aluminum or steel. If those permits are given for free, they'll have to be given the same across all European countries. There's going to be a much more level playing field. And finally, and we might talk a bit about CDM, there'll be tighter limits on the use of offsets in Europe until there's some new international agreement on reducing emissions. So this shows you what Europe's targets are graphically. And I've got two graphs here I'd like to show you. The first one shows what Europe's overall targets are for the period 1990 to 2020. 1990 emissions here are taken as 100. And this is economy-wide for the moment. We're not talking about the cap and trade scheme. So Europe has a target to reduce emissions by 2008, by now, by 8% from 1990 levels, hold that steady for 5 years, and then reduce to 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. You'll see there are two lines on the right-hand side. The blue line is what Europe has committed to do regardless of what the rest of the world does. And the green line is what Europe has offered to do if the rest of the world takes comparable measures. So there's an offer, a negotiation going on. The red squiggly line is actual emissions. So you see that Europe is pretty much on track to meet its Kyoto targets. Second graph shows, this is the cap and trade program now, so the 40% of European emissions. This shows what the cap is relative to 2005 actual emissions. Pink line across the top is 2005 actual emissions, and the blue line is what the cap is set at. And you'll see it stays constant until about 2012, and then goes on a sharp downward slope to 2050. And that figure is the proposal is that slope, the angle of that slope is what will be set in European law. So the intention there is to give industry a bit more certainty about what Europe's plans are, and also to avoid the constant round of negotiations between European countries about what the cap should be. It's worth talking a little bit about offsets, and so this will probably be quite familiar to a lot of people in the room, but I think it's worth saying. Suppose this is a situation where you have two companies, A and B, who both emit 100 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Company A decides that it will obtain 100 allowances, emission allowances, 100 permits, to match those 100 tons of emissions. Company B decides that it will only obtain 90 of those allowances, but it will buy 10 offset credits from projects outside Europe, emission reduction projects outside Europe, to match the additional 10 tons. Now, what European companies are allowed to do is to do what Company B is doing there, to use offsets to cover a small percentage of their emissions. Varies by country, but it's about 13% overall. What are those offsets? The main generator of those offsets is something called the Clean Development Mechanism. Again, a US proposal as part of Kyoto. It was, what it is a program that allows companies to invest in emission reductions outside Europe, and they can count the reductions they make in those projects they've invested in to counterbalance, to offset their own emissions within Europe. As I've said, up to a certain limit. There's been a lot of controversy about CDM, and most of it can be boiled down to that buzzword there, additionality. Essentially what that says is that when companies say they go to China and they're investing in a renewable energy project, they get credit for reducing emissions by that project below what would have happened anyway. And the problem is all in that phrase, what would have happened anyway. It's impossible to prove what would have happened in the absence of your investment. And so companies are supposed to make conservative assessments of what that alternative world would have been, and then claim the difference between what actually happens and what that alternative would have been. Difficult to agree on that. Some other difficulties with the CDM, such as the fact that it's been rather more successful in generating projects than they thought it would be. Somebody said to me once that when they were setting up the CDM, they thought that it might generate 300 projects if they were lucky. It's now into the thousands and counting. So the infrastructure that runs the CDM is straining a bit. The CDM is also, like the ETS, being reviewed this year and next year, and I think there will be significant changes to it, not least possibly a move away from the project-based approach. What's the timeline for doing all this? As I said, Europe's proposals for the third phase were published in January this year as part of Europe's scoping plan, if you like. Those now are going through the Parliament, and the Parliament's now commented on them, generally strengthening them. And over the next 6 months, Europe will be negotiating internally about what of those changes are acceptable and what aren't. The hope is that there can be overall agreement on it by the end of 2008, and that those proposals will become law in early 2009. That gives us time to prepare for what's marked there as COP15 in Copenhagen, that is the crunch meeting of parties to the Kyoto Protocol, of the countries and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Countries who have seen their targets expiring at the end of 2012 and are coming together at the end of next year to try and renegotiate them. In fact, if you've been following the news, you noticed that the G8 made a statement yesterday about the necessity of getting an agreement at that meeting. So we'll see if that happens. This graph may look familiar, but actually there's an addition. This shows you the effect of the Commission's proposals, the proposals for 2013 onwards, on the price of emissions. The old blue and pink lines are the same, but you see in the top right-hand corner, there's a green line, which is the price that European companies will pay in 2013-14. That's not a projection. That's the price they're willing to pay now. That's the price that emissions allowances are trading for 2013 are trading at today. So if we go on to the next slide, the market is actually treating 2013, 2014 pretty much as it's treating the current phase. One of the problems that climate policy has had in the past is that hard Kyoto targets end in 2012. And there was always this cliff edge where the carbon price stopped and nobody knew what was going to happen. That line there shows that that cliff edge has now become more of a slope. And you'll be paying about $50 a ton in 2013 in Europe. I talked a lot about Europe. I'd like to talk a little bit quickly about what's happening outside Europe, what other countries are doing, and what about those emissions that aren't assigned to any country, like aviation, international aviation, and shipping. Programs in operation in a number of countries, Europe, in countries close to Europe, and in New Zealand for forestry. And obviously a number of programs in discussion in the US, which I'm sure people are familiar with. Also an Australian federal program and Japan. Graphical representation of that. This graph, you'll notice, is slightly distorted. It doesn't show you the land areas of countries have been changed to reflect their total emissions. So what you'll notice is that in the middle of the picture, Africa, for example, is very thin. US, Europe, Japan, very large. And this is much, so the black area is countries that have or are considering cap and trade programs, and the colored areas are other countries. And what this, if you could add up the areas in this graph, you'd see that the black areas cover about 50%. Linking. Europe's talked a lot about joining up carbon markets, about having a cap and trade program in one country that would link to and be recognized by a cap and trade program in another country. Various reasons for doing that. Reduces total costs of the world, gives you most incentive to find those low-cost opportunities. Gives much more of a level playing field for business that trades internationally. They face the same price of emissions, or same price for emitting as their competitors elsewhere. And it broadens and deepens the market. It makes them more difficult to manipulate. It makes them less prone to sudden spikes. Generally improves their functioning. On the other hand, if you link your cap and trade program to somebody else's cap and trade program, you're taking on many of the rules that they have chosen for their program. So there needs to be some careful consideration and some coordination of that. And in fact, there is a body which California is chair of at the moment called the International Carbon Action Partnership, which has been set up to do just that. Aviation, a very timely slide. International aviation was not covered by the Kyoto Protocol. Nobody could agree which country a flight from country A to country B should be assigned to. And so it was never included. That was the stated reason, anyway. Aviation is a problem. There's no real alternative to kerosene in the short term. There's no real travel substitution options for a long-haul flight, particularly. High-speed rail may be a possibility for short-haul. And you can't tax it. So what Europe has decided, and this was agreed by the Parliament yesterday, was that they would include emissions from aviation for all flights entering or leaving Europe from January 1, 2012. That will at least bring the emissions from aviation within the overall cap, and so total emissions from that and from European energy and industry will be limited. The other problem with aviation is that the impact of it is more than was suggested by CO2 alone. The science on this, I understand, is not settled yet, but I think the feeling is that it's between about 2.5 and 4 times the effect of you would expect just from the CO2 from a long-haul flight because of changes to the atmosphere. And that's about the limit of my scientific understanding. So, I'm glad to know I've come to the end. Put those points up there. They're all really a summary of what I've been saying for the last 40, 45 minutes. I think if I'd pick 2, I'd say don't be misled by the pilot. Look at the current program, and don't worry if it's not perfect at the start. Right. Any questions?
Why don't I start with a couple of questions from the web. First one is from our good friend Taylor Miller of Sempro Energy, who always adds lots of fun to our workshops. He says, thank you for your interesting and informative presentation. What is the level of the proposed EU RPS standards? He has more than one, but more concerned.
Okay. The proposed European RPS standard is 20%, but that's 20% of all energy, not electricity. So in practice, it would be more like 30-odd% electricity.
Another question he has, can you estimate what portion of overall needed reductions in the EU are planned to come from a declining cap as opposed to direct regulation?
Good question. I don't think anybody's done that calculation. I'll have another look at the Commission's proposal and see if I can get a number for you. But I don't know the number offhand, I'm sorry.
Another one. Is the point of regulation for the electricity sector the generator?
Yes.
Close enough. To what extent has electricity generator compliance been achieved by fossil fuel switching at existing facilities?
To a very significant extent. I suspect it's the majority, if not the vast majority, at this stage. Certainly, when we were looking at the available options, that's the main one.
I have a question. The ETS you said for, I believe, phase 3 are the ones that do not expire, or the ones for phase 2?
I'm sorry, phase 2. So the ones that are being issued now don't expire.
So phase 2 will expire in 12?
No, phase 2 will never expire.
So neither of them?
Neither of them will expire.
Okay. Thanks.
Ian, thank you for an excellent presentation. My question is regarding the CDMs. You talked about the process being revised. So my question is, what happens to the current credits? And to the extent that there is excess, meaning more than you expected, are they all going to be used up, or is there going to be sufficient demand?
Let me think about that. When you do a CDM project, you get credits for, I think it's you can choose either to get credits for a guaranteed 10 years or for 7 years with 2 renewal periods. So you can get guaranteed for 7, then at the 7-year point, they check whether you're still producing. You can get another 7 at the 14-year point. They check, and you can get another. So existing projects will get that the credits from that timescale. If too many are produced, I think the estimate is that 1.4 billion tons is going to be produced by the end of 2012. What Europe said is that the total number of offsets, 1.4 billion will be allowed into Europe by the end of 2012. What Europe has said is that you will either be able to use those in 2008 to 12, or you'll be able to use that limit in 2013 to 20. But you won't be able to bring any more in. I don't think CDM, the EU ETS is not the only source of demand for those credits as well. National governments can buy those CDM credits, those CDM offsets too, to cover part of their emissions targets under Kyoto. So I don't think there's much risk of an excess. Certainly they're trading about 20 euros a ton each at the moment, so certainly people think there's enough demand for them.
Let me do another email question. This one is from Carbon Cycle Consulting. It says, how do we know that the 200 million ton reductions are not due to energy-intensive companies moving outside of EU?
We did some very detailed assessments of the impact of ETS on companies. And we looked at the relative impact of the carbon price on them as a percentage of their value add, and looked at that across, I think it's about 19 sectors, and we went to a subsectoral level, so quite a detailed analysis. Our assessment was that only a very few sectors would actually see a significant cost as part of this program, a significant risky cost, if I can put it that way. And that's those sectors that use a lot of energy and are heavily traded internationally. Things like transport costs mean that a lot of products are not heavily traded internationally, and so the argument that you can move outside Europe actually isn't as strong as some people suggest. So while we can never give a guaranteed there will be no movement outside Europe, I think we've satisfied ourselves that if there were any movement, it would only be in a small number of sectors. And actually, what we're doing for those sectors is we're giving them all the allowance permits they need for free. So there's not really, the cost to them should be contained.
Shall I do one more? The last one? Okay. This one is from Rob Grunwald. It says, Mr. Morrow, would you please offer your opinion on how well or whether an emission cap and trade program would work if limited to one U.S. state, as opposed to...
Any in mind?
As opposed to being extended to a collection of 27 nations. Will this artificially small trading system quickly become distorted and inefficient?
Is that a leading question? Well, look, I mean, I decided before I started this talk that I was going to talk about the European experience, and I wasn't going to talk about what that means for the US. So I'm afraid I'm going to have not answer that question. I think that's a question for the state in question, whichever it might be.
Hi, thank you very much. One question, and it is on the issue of allocation and windfalls. And you opened it up, and you said you were willing to discuss it. So we're going to discuss it, hopefully. I see that you have talked, and you have presented in your discussion here, kind of going back and forth between allocation or return or auction proceeds. And we've been talking in California, and I think in the U.S. in general, about auction revenue right, allocation of auction revenue rights, or direct allocation. You mentioned that it's a political process and largely independent of the abatement decisions. I agree with that. What we're seeing in California, however, is that a fear of an adverse allocation decision has driven some stakeholders to simply oppose cap and trade for that purpose alone. And so my curiosity is, my concern is that, of course, we're seeing people modify their positions here in California, but I'm curious what the current state of debate is in Europe, because you mentioned that this is a very hot topic. what type of revenue return mechanisms are being discussed in Europe, and where you would handicap this process?
Okay. I suppose my response to what you said about stakeholders wanting to be left out of the program would be, well, you're going to have to be regulated by something. So would you prefer a tax, or would you prefer direct regulation? In terms of where the revenue return discussion is going, there's the whole range in Europe. There's a whole range of opinions. There's national governments who say that auction revenue is ours and we'll spend it. The European Parliament has suggested that $20 billion of the auction rights should be used to fund carbon capture and storage demonstration projects. People want to use it to fund deforestation, not fund deforestation, to avoid deforestation. People want to use it to support renewable energy. You know, there's an $80 billion pot out there, and everybody who's got a project in mind that they think is a good idea is angling for a piece of it. There's also people who would like to return that value to particularly low-income consumers, people who spend a lot of their money on energy and heating and electricity. So I can't give you an answer as to where it's going to go. I think the most I can say is it's a live debate. I'm sorry it doesn't really answer your question.
Hi. Going back to the issue of carbon leakage and free permits, and perhaps the question from the web may have partially answered my question, but I was hoping to understand better the process and the rules and the mechanism whereby an industry could sufficiently petition to say, hey, I'm unique,
yeah.
How that will work going forward, and is there a stopping point where when there's enough competitors, countries under the cap, they no longer would get the free permits? I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Okay, sure. So it's about the process for deciding which industries are at risk of moving outside Europe and how much protection they should get. Is that? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, I mean, it's kind of underway. I mean, we have a lot of stakeholder meetings with a wide variety of industry, all 19 sectors that are represented. And we have been through a process where we commissioned some consultants to produce a report which looked at how exposed sectors were. That report was then rubbished by industry. And so they came up with some data which we've used to refine the report, and we have redone it. Now, that's going to go on that's at a UK level. That's at a country level. The European Commission, European Union, if you like, is doing the same process. So they are commissioning people to look at how much trade there is between sectors. They're asking industry to provide data on what the trade is in their sector, how much they import, how much they export. And that will, let me get my dates right here. That will then, okay. Under current proposals, a decision is going to be made in 2011, I think, on which sectors are really at risk. Because by that date, if we go back to the timeline slide, by the end of 2009, things will be a lot clearer about which countries are in, which countries are out. So a decision before that date doesn't really make sense, and it takes a lot of time to gather the data for 19 sectors anyway. So 2011, they'll make an assessment of which sectors are at risk. I think 2013, they'll say what the measures are going to be. No, sorry, it must be 2012 they'll say what the measures are going to be. So I suppose it's a dialogue with stakeholders, gathering data, it's commissioning research, which is going to go on for the next 3 years.
And then some central body says, aluminum or cement, you get free permits for X period of time.
Yes.
We'll relook at it.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
The central body, which is the European Commission, which is kind of the sort of super regulator in Europe.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. I was struck by your conclusion on number 6, which is excess volatility is exaggerated. And I was looking back on the price of emissions in Europe and looking at the quarterly change and seeing some volatility there. Between quarters, the price will go up 100%, drop 35, go up 35, drop 20. These are back of the envelope calculations, and then go up 50 over the course of a year, which is a pretty big swing. And I was thinking if the cost of carbon is encapsulated in the energy price in Europe, it may not appear to be highly volatile because the energy price in Europe is probably twice what it is in this region, something like that. But if that kind of volatility were applied here, it might appear to be volatile. I mean, so I'd like you to kind of express your thoughts on that volatility issue.
Okay, sure. Which number slide are you looking at?
Well, I was looking at the summary slide where you said excess volatility is exaggerated.
Okay.
And then I was looking at the price of emissions in Europe slide, which is page 30.
Okay, which were you looking at, the blue or the pink line?
I was looking at the red line.
Okay. Okay, it's my color vision then. Fine. With the red line, I mean, yeah, there was a lot of volatility at the start of the program, and my recollection is that in the US SO2 program there was a lot of volatility at the start as well. People took some time to work out how much this stuff is worth. But what you see, if I can go back here, is that volatility is actually coming down. So it was high, but actually it is coming down. And you talked about European power prices. The price of emissions is pretty well correlated with the price of electricity and natural gas in Europe. And so when they move, it moves. But actually, it moves less because it's not just electricity prices and natural gas prices that are affecting it. It's other things too. In terms of European energy prices, in the UK, the ETS increased power prices by about 10 to 15%. So you're right, you wouldn't see, the power price doesn't jump up and down as much as the CO2 price does. So it's not, and the increases are trivial compared to the increases from natural gas prices. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess when you convert it to a percentage, that the carbon value increased the energy price by roughly 10%.
Yeah.
And if the energy price in Europe is, assuming an international price for carbon, and if the energy value or price in Europe is 2 times what it is in this region, you would probably expect to see, what, a 20-25% increase in the energy price here. I'm just doing back of the envelope math in my head.
It depends what's at the margin here. It's probably natural gas here, whereas it is in a lot of Europe, it's coal.
This is natural gas.
Yeah, so you probably see less because the increase is proportional to the carbon intensity of the marginal fuel. So if you guys are running on natural gas, Europe, a lot of Europe, Germany, Poland, running on coal at the margin, then the increase here is going to be lower because of that. So it might not be double.
A couple of questions with regard to that. Because of you said the price of carbon should be lower here because we're already using natural gas. But I think we're constrained in a number of ways. Number one, we are using natural gas.
Yes.
And the transition for a few companies from coal will obviously incur some costs. But then there's not much you do once you go from natural gas because we don't have nuclear or not allowed to use nuclear.
This is true.
The second thing is that the measures that you listed there was cap and trade was one measure, energy efficiency and renewables were other measures. Are those measures included in your cap the way they are proposed for the scoping plan so that some of the reductions will actually be attributed to renewables, or are the reductions in the cap and trade in addition to what you're already going to be required to do?
Okay, let me answer the first one first. Sorry, I wasn't clear. What I said was that the impact on electricity prices of carbon would be less here. I didn't say that the carbon price would be lower. That depends on what the options are. And as you say, there's much less coal on the system here in California than there is in Europe. The second one, sorry, remind me of a moment there.
In our proposed plan, we're proposing to incorporate renewables and energy efficiency within the cap, and I was wondering if that was the same.
It's a mixture. They're kind of half in and half out. if some of the renewable portfolio standard in Europe is energy-wide, so it's transport, heating, and electricity. Only electricity is in the cap. So any measures that affect renewable electricity are in the cap. Any measures that affect renewable heating or renewable transport are not. Energy efficiency measures, again, some of them affect sectors that are in the cap, some of them affect sectors that aren't. So it's some are in, some are out, depending on which sector they affect. Is that?
Yeah, Eric Emblem, just it was a great presentation, but one thing I haven't heard, and I've sat through a lot of these presentations on cap and trades, and I think the European model is being looked at, is the effect on labor. And I think one of the questions here kind of ties into that, and that's about carbon-intensive industries relocating.
Yeah.
And in the States, it may be relocating to states without a program. In your scenario, it may be locating to countries that maybe the permits are less and more lenient. I want to know what your experience has been with that.
We haven't seen any evidence of it yet. And as I said, we did assess what sectors were at risk, and we looked at what percentage of UK employment that was, and it's a very small percentage. It's some fraction of 1%. One of the proposals is that some of the auction money be used to retrain, to manage the transition from those energy-intensive industries to low-carbon energy, to low-carbon industries, so renewables and so on. So it's not. I think we've looked at the potential for there to be a problem. We've put measures in place to make sure the industry doesn't move out anyway. And if it turns out that we were wrong, then there are possibilities for transitioning people from one sector to another. Is that?
A couple of questions from the internet. This one is from Russ Philbrick, and says, in previous response about giving free credits to industries that may be driven out, what prevents these industries from leaving anyways while taking these credits as independent assets?
Well, if they leave, they won't get any more in the future. So, I mean, that's the preventative measure. But yeah, there's no way to prevent that. I think this actually is a good time to talk about competitiveness in general, maybe, which is, I think we're confusing here the instrument with the goal. And what Europe has done and what California has done is they've signed up to goals already. And now they're looking for ways to do it. And what Europe's done is they've decided to use cap and trade because that's the cheapest, they think, way to do it. And one of the reasons for doing that is that you minimize the competitive impact. You minimize the extra standards that you have to put on people in Europe. You minimize the extra costs that European industry faces. So given the goals that we've set, this instrument should minimize the amount of leakage that we've got. So questions about leakage, I think, are more questions about, is this the right goal? Should we be doing it on our own? Than questions about the instrument. Sound too defensive?
Another question says, if a company moves outside of the EU carbon market, what happens to the credits? Retired? Can they sell them?
They can sell them.
A lot of interest right now in commodity speculation, in particular oil in the U.S. And so I'm kind of curious about your phase 3 speculators in terms of who are the types of entities that are purchasing phase 3 reductions and sort of what volume at this point?
It's pretty low volume. I mean, they only started trading that on the screen about 3 months ago. Yeah, extremely low volume. Trades are anonymous, and we allow anyone to hold the permits, so we can't know exactly who. We suspect that power companies, the same way as they hedge their electricity and their natural gas out 5-6 years, will be doing the same to carbon, because if the price of those permits is in the electricity price, they've got that risk. But there are hedge funds doing that as well, I'm sure.
Some economists have suggested that the CDM is the loophole that makes the cost manageable in Europe. if you modify the CDM, especially if you get rid of what some other economists consider to be phony reductions, such as capital investments in small hydro and things like that, which are thought to be projects that really shouldn't qualify. Have you estimated the change in the cost of credits that would likely come from closing the CDM loophole?
Yes. I just got, funny you should ask that. This is figures from the Commission about the impact of the program, and they did some analysis looking at, this is their high oil case, it was $100 a barrel. And what they said was that they thought the price in the third phase would be 39 euros per metric ton of CO2 with no CDM allowed. And that would be that cost goes down as the oil price goes up.
AB 32 has a provision about a safety valve. Was there such a provision in the EU ETS?
No, and Europe was always very against it. Essentially, what a safety valve does is it benefits coal generators at the expense of people who are actually reducing emissions. It cuts off the upside for investors in renewables, and it also means that you're not guaranteed to achieve your target, achieve your goal. So I think another reason for not doing it is essentially agreeing an upper price limit is about as easy as agreeing a tax, because it's a numeric value on the amount you're going to pay. So it's never going to fly.
The over allocation allowance, how much of that is due to ignorance about business as usual emissions, and how much of it is it as the companies, as they were starting to track their carbon dioxide, found easy and cheap ways to reduce some of it?
It's a good question and difficult to know. There's a guy at MIT called Denny Ellerman who did an estimate, and he suggests that companies probably reduced by somewhere between 50 and 100 million tons a year, he thinks. But that's very speculative. So I think it's a combination of the two factors you suggested.
I have to disagree with your comments on a safety valve.
Do you have any renewables?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Sorry, go on, say.
And just for purposes of full disclosure, I know you know where I work, and some people in here do. I work at Southern California Edison. Your comment regarding setting the safety valve, I understand the difficult nature of that. I think there have been a fair number of people who have talked about flexible type instruments that wouldn't result in within the confines of AB 32 busting the 2020 cap. In other words, you allow for a flatter reduction curve in one period, and then of course you'd have a steeper reduction curve over time. So that does not result in you not meeting your emission reductions. In other words, I suggest that perhaps the very terse comment that a safety valve does not allow you to meet your cap is not necessarily and always accurate.
Okay. So I was taking safety valve very narrowly as an upper limit on the price. But there's other mechanisms, as you suggest, for safety valves, such as the ability to change your emissions profile over time. And actually, essentially, for 2008 to 12, companies can borrow and bank within that pretty much as they want. So companies can more or less choose their own profile. So if they want to reduce not very much in the first couple of years while they're getting that investment, that emission reduction investment in place, and then have a steep slope down towards the end, that's their choice. Well, I mean, European borrowing is quite limited. I mean, it's set up so that companies can borrow from 1 year ahead. So when you're coming to comply for, say, 2008, so it's early first quarter 2009. You've got to comply for 2008. You have in your hand your allowances for 2008 and for 2009, and you can use them to comply. So there's limited borrowing, and the amount of borrowing, if you think about how that works, will decrease over time. And I can't speak to the California situation. The other safety valve, I suppose, is CDM, is offsets. Europe has decided that it's going to allow some of those in, but with limits, and the suggestions that those limits will be qualitative, so type in future, as well as just a simple numerical limit.
Okay, here's a question from Cal Hodge. That's a long one. Cap and trade seems to raise fuel prices that will eventually cause consumers to select more efficient devices. Has any discussion considered having consumers buy carbon emissions allowances based upon the relative efficiency of their choices when they purchase a carbon-emitting device?
Okay, so this looks like a question about personal carbon allowances. And what the question is asking is, should we, when consumers buy a product, get them to have to buy allowances based on how much carbon that product emits? We did look at that. I think the difficulty with that is that it's very, very complicated. It requires every single consumer to know how to trade carbon. And I think one of the other lessons, which I didn't mention from the first phase, is that it took parts of industry quite a while to get adjusted to this carbon trading thing. And I think the difficulties would be magnified with a consumer program. So my answer to the question is, yes, you could in theory, but I think there's a lot of practical hurdles to overcome before you could get there. And I'm not sure they could be.
Just to go back to the previous question about the borrowing ahead, how long is your compliance period? Because if you had a 3-year, wouldn't that be in a form of ahead borrowing?
Yeah, the compliance period is effectively 5, the way it works. So each phase is a compliance period. So you have to true up at the end of 2012 for everything you emitted in 08 to 12. And you have to true up at the end of each year, but you can take stuff from the following year. So we do have a kind of multi-year compliance period already, but it's not quite the same, I think, as what might have been discussed here, where there's no true up at the end of each calendar year. There's only at the end of the 3. Yeah, sorry, it's not. Okay, so it's probably easiest to do it on a timeline. So you come to the end of 2008 and you work out what your emissions are. You get them checked, and you have in your hand your 2008 allowances, your 2008 permits. And then in February 2009, you get your 2009 permits. And then in April 2009, you've got to true up to match your emissions against your permits for 2008. But you have 2 years' worth of permits in your hand. And then the following year, you'll have to true up for 2009, but you'll have 8, 9, and 10 emissions in your hand, and so on and so on. So it's very difficult to translate into a language of multi-year compliance periods, but it is a way of borrowing from the future. And in fact, it's a way of allowing more borrowing at the start of the program when it's difficult to reduce emissions because your options are limited, it takes time, and rather than later on where your options are more varied.
Is the borrowing that you just described, is that transparent to the marketplace so that, for example, I would know that somebody else borrowed a bunch this year and then the next year they're going to be in the market big time buying stuff?
You don't have to disclose how much you hold, if that's your question.
How much you use.
How much you use, yes. You have to disclose how much you use.
And the year from which the allowance came.
You have to, I think you've got to publish your emissions shortly after the April true-up. So you know how much people have used. You don't know how much people have. So they could be holding them, and there's no need for them to disclose. In the same way as there's no need for them to disclose their gas holdings.
So using your description, so the April true-up in 2009 would tell me how many allowances party X would use and apply it against the year 2008.
Yes.
And I would know how many of their 2009 allowances they used for that application, so I would know theoretically
No, not
what they're going
necessarily.
to get.
No, you'd know how many allowances they used. You wouldn't be able to distinguish 08 and 09. Or CDM, exactly. You'd know how much they emitted. That's what you'd know how many tons they emitted. And so you would be able to work out how many allowances they needed to hand over. But whether those allowances are 08, 09, CDM offsets, whatever, you wouldn't know that.
So that could interject a level of volatility if somebody were using, we're having to go into market in the future to cover this year. That market demand would go up pretty high if they had borrowed.
You could. I mean, most of the power companies who are the big guys, they say they hedge 12 to 18 months ahead anyway. So you probably wouldn't get that. And in a sense, I don't see why it would necessarily inject a lot of volatility. If you're saying if you're short, is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm going to be short. I mean, under the assumption that they're not freely allocated,
okay.
I'm going to need to go out into the market and get something.
Okay.
So by definition, everybody's short.
Okay.
They're trying to estimate in the future how volatile that market's going to be and when to buy.
Okay.
If somebody had borrowed a lot, they're going to have to replace that in the future, I assume. So their participation in the future market is going to be much higher. And it begs the question about how hedge funds play in this, or if they can.
Oh, they can. Yeah. You can, anyone can hold them. Individuals, companies, anyone can hold them. Yeah, well, you can be short, but it's very similar to this situation in the natural gas market. If you know you're going to need some natural gas 2 years out, you buy it in the forward market. If you know you're going to need some carbon 2 years out, you buy it in the forward market. There's a very liquid forward market, at least 12 to 24 months out. So there's not. And if you're running a big short position, then there might be questions asked about how you're going to cover that. So I don't see why it would lead to all this volatility. I mean, if you look at where's my graph? If you look at this graph here, I mean, what that's telling you is that the price of emissions is going up by pretty much the risk-free rate. It's a nice, smooth, backwardated graph. And what that's saying is that those allowances are pretty much fungible between years. So if 1 year was a lot of demand, that will be counterbalanced by less demand. That can be counterbalanced by less demand in future years, if there's a low hydro year, for example. So I'm not sure why it should make more of an issue in this market than in others. And in a sense, you don't need, in this market, there's no sudden need for them, because you only need them at the end of each year to true up. You don't need them immediately to run your plant. So why it should be more volatile in this market than in others, I'm not clear.
I actually wanted to let's continue on this one, Steve. Because this is actually an issue where Steve and I usually fight with each other. But I think if the maturity, if the term of the allowance is not known, if the holding of the allowance on an entity level is not known, and then of course CDM, the sacrifice of the retirement of a CDM versus an allowance is not known, I don't know that if all of that is held confidential, then I think that helps to mitigate any kind of market manipulation being applied to a specific entity. Now, maybe because we know, as you mentioned, the entire industry is short, and if you do the math, everybody's borrowed ahead, then our friends at Morgan Stanley or anybody else might decide to more dearly hold on to those allowances that they have. But on an entity-specific level, I think that maybe that type of confidentiality that you guys have developed there would certainly be helpful.
Yeah, I mean the other, you're right as well that you won't know what each entity is holding, but you'll know the total supply. And in fact, you'll know the total supply very well, much more than you know the total supply of a normal commodity. You know, there's a big number, 2,080 million per year. That's the total supply, plus 1.4 billion CDM allowed in. So you know the total supply very well. You know how much has been used in year one. You know how much has been used in year two. You can get a pretty good idea of what's available for the future. So estimating whether people are borrowing, whether people are holding a lot in expectation the price will go up. It's actually, estimating the price is quite difficult, but I don't see why it should be any more difficult in this market than it is in others, and there's reasons for it to seem easier.
Could you just quickly summarize the enforcement and penalty side of this program?
Yeah. If you must hold enough allowances at the end of in April 09 to true up to cover your emissions in 08. If you don't, you face €100, so that's $160, $170 a ton penalty, and you have to make up the difference the following year. So there's no reason not to comply. I'm sorry? The penalty increases by the Eurozone interest rate. Sorry, Eurozone inflation rate.
And how many times a year do you auction? Because that might be another way of smoothing out the volatility.
We haven't, that's a good question, and we haven't decided yet. We're thinking about quarterly. There's been nobody seems to want yearly. They think that's too infrequent. There have been suggestions of daily. People have suggested selling it on eBay. I think quarterly, I think, is the front runner.
I think we've used up a couple of hours. And are there burning questions? We'll take one more and then wrap it up after that. I'll thank you for coming. This was very exciting. Thank you, Ian. It was a great presentation. And I didn't know you knew so much.
Thank you, Ferdinand.
Okay, the last question from Miriam.
Thank you. So if the electricity sector is in, but the liquid fuel sector is out?
You mean transportation, gasoline and diesel?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So some transit is in, but some transit is out.
Yes.
Is that on the agenda for future modification?
That's on the agenda. Europe faces much higher gas and diesel prices anyway. I mean, it's about double the prices in California, and most of that is tax. So fuels are already pretty heavily taxed. They already have a pretty heavy cost penalty associated with them. We did some estimates that suggested that if you included liquid fuels in the program, then prices would go up, I think it's about 2 cents for every euro of the price. So they'd go up about 50 cents. Now, Europe already has gas prices about $8.50, $9. So it's not relatively a big increase.
So that also would address the private consumer?
It would, and it's one of the reasons that Europe is thinking about including liquid fuels in, but it hasn't done so yet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.